My name is Joe Henry, and I've spent the last few months chasing something that most people wouldn't dare look for. In a world decimated by the plague, where the infected outnumber the living, there's one thing that keeps me going. The hope that somewhere, hidden deep beneath the ruins, there's an answer. It started with a forgotten military outpost, a place I shouldn't have found. From there, everything spiraled: secrets, survival, and a terrifying truth. What I thought was just a fight for survival turned out to be something far more dangerous. Now I'm searching for answers that might just change everything. I hadn't planned on finding anything when I was scavenging along the old highway. Just looking for supplies, food, water, anything that might keep me going for another few days. But as I stumbled through the overgrown path, half buried under a tangle of debris and vines, I saw a rusted gate bearing the faded insignia of the U.S. military. Outpost Delta 17. The letters were barely legible, but I knew what it was, or at least what it was supposed to be. A military outpost from the early days of the collapse. The kind of place that should have been left forgotten. From the outside, it didn't look like much: shattered windows, crumbling walls, and an eerie silence that only those who've wandered through abandoned places understand. Still, something about the outpost called to me, like it was waiting for me to uncover what had been lost. What secrets had been left to rot in the shadows of this forsaken place? Cautiously, I stepped through the rusted gate and into the compound. The wind howled through the empty corridors, a soft reminder that I wasn't alone. Not really. The weight of time seemed to press down on every broken wall, every forgotten desk. My boots echoed in the silence as I made my way deeper into the compound. It wasn't just any abandoned facility, it felt like there was something more buried beneath the dust and decay. The first room I entered looked like a hastily abandoned command center. Maps were pinned to the walls, some frayed with age, others marked with strange symbols I couldn't make sense of. There were quarantine zones, evacuation routes, and areas that didn't appear on any map I knew. Whoever had been stationed here had left in a hurry, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened in this place was no ordinary evacuation. On a desk in the corner, half hidden beneath piles of paperwork, I found a battered journal. Its pages were water-stained and torn, but still legible. The name on the cover stood out to me: Charles Whitmore. I had no idea who he was, but something told me I needed to read his words. I flipped open the journal, hoping it would shed light on what had gone wrong here. At first, Whitmore's entries were routine reports on troop movement, supply chains, and logistical notes about the outbreak. It was just another soldier's log until it wasn't. As I read on, the tone of the journal shifted from the mundane to something much darker. His first mention of Operation Horizon caught my eye. It seemed like any other military project at first, developing a bioweapon, targeting enemy combatants while leaving infrastructure untouched. The virus was supposed to be a tactical advantage, a weapon of precision, but as the weeks wore on, Whitmore's entries became increasingly unsettling. They keep telling us the risk is worth the reward. But I'm not so sure anymore. The next few pages were worse. Whitmore began describing the tests, the subjects, people, volunteers, and prisoners turned into something else. The virus they were working with wasn't just killing its subjects, it was changing them. They're stronger, faster, and harder to contain. The line between human and monster was blurring, and Whitmore wasn't sure if the project was the key to victory or the beginning of humanity's end. One entry stopped me dead in my tracks. Containment breach happened fast. Subject 23 broke free, attacked the staff. It bit Dr. Morgan, and within hours, Morgan changed. We sealed the lower levels. Command ordered us to abandon the outpost. They left us here to die. The final entry was a chilling testament to their failure. To anyone who finds this, we didn't know. We didn't know it would spread like this. We didn't know it would think. Forgive us. I let the journal drop from my hands as the weight of those words sank in. What had they unleashed? What had they created here? The questions raced through my mind, but they were quickly drowned out by a strange noise. A faint eye turned and saw something gleaming in the corner of the room. An old reel-to-reel recorder covered in dust but still functional. I hesitated, but curiosity won. I pressed play, and what I heard next was far worse than I could have imagined. The first recording was a series of faint footsteps, too heavy, too deliberate. They weren't human. The second was worse. It started with the low hum of machinery, then came the whispers, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder. A voice not entirely human, calling for help, repeating the words over and over. It wasn't just a plea, it was something else. Something wrong. The last recording was the worst of all. The sound of metal scraping against metal, followed by screams. Not just one person, but many. All trapped in a loop of agony. I don't know what happened after Whitmore's final entry, but I knew one thing for sure. Outpost Delta 17 had been erased from official records for a reason. Whatever they had been doing here, whatever they had created, it wasn't meant for the battlefield. It wasn't meant for anything. As I left the compound, I looked back one last time. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement in one of the windows, something watching me. But it was gone before I could be sure. Maybe it was my imagination. Or maybe Delta 17 isn't as abandoned as it seems. This section blends discovery, mystery, and the hint of an emerging threat, leading seamlessly into the unfolding conspiracy. After my disturbing discovery at Outpost Delta 17, I thought I had seen the worst of what the military had done. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized that the horrors here were far deeper, far darker than I could have imagined. It didn't take long for me to stumble upon something even more terrifying. A series of intercepted military transmissions, fragments that had once seemed insignificant, but now felt like clues leading me towards something far more sinister. I had been tracking these transmissions for days, picking up faint static and bursts of encrypted chatter. At first, it was nothing more than random noise. Orders barked over crackling lines, strings of meaningless code, and occasional bursts of military jargon. But then I heard it again. Red Horizon. The term popped up repeatedly in the transmissions, at first casually, then with an increasing sense of urgency. I didn't understand it at first, but it was clear that this wasn't just an operation. It was a directive, something far more serious, something that could change everything. Red Horizon, I would soon learn, wasn't just a name. It was a protocol, a military strategy that had been set in motion during the early stages of the outbreak. And its objective was chillingly simple: contain the infection at all costs. But as I dug deeper into the transmissions, the true meaning of Red Horizon became far more insidious. It wasn't just about stopping the spread of the virus, it was about erasing all traces of what had happened. The truth, the ugly truth, had to stay buried. In one particularly damning transmission, I overheard a conversation between two soldiers stationed near one of the target zones, one of the cities that had been marked for obliteration. The transmission began with a shaky voice. The soldier clearly conflicted. "Do you really think this is necessary?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. "There are still people in there." The second soldier's response sent chills down my spine. "Doesn't matter, command says it's the only way. We light it up or we're next." There was a long pause, and then the first soldier spoke again, quieter this time. "What did we even unleash?" The transmission ended abruptly, replaced by the sound of shouting and gunfire, followed by a deafening silence. The eerie quiet after the chaos was unsettling, as though the military had already begun to carry out their orders, wiping out entire populations to keep the truth from leaking. But it wasn't just the soldiers' words that haunted me. It was the memo attached to the protocol. A chilling note addressed to someone high up in the chain of command, perhaps a general or a politician. The memo outlined the stakes of the operation in stark clinical terms. If this operation fails, the consequences are incalculable. Red Horizon is not just about containment. It's about ensuring plausible deniability. The public must never know the full extent of what we created. The words felt like a punch to the gut. What we created. It was clear now that this wasn't some naturally occurring virus or an accidental outbreak. The virus was engineered, manufactured, and the powers that be were willing to sacrifice millions of lives, reducing entire cities to ash, just to keep the public from knowing the truth. I couldn't believe it at first. How could they be so willing to eradicate everything, to bury the past just to maintain control? But then I intercepted another transmission, one that left no room for doubt. It came from a civilian ham radio operator, someone who had survived a nuclear strike in one of the target zones. He described a scene of unimaginable devastation, entire cities reduced to rubble, skies choked with ash, and the eerie silence that followed. But there was something worse. He described how the blast hadn't killed the infected, it had changed them. They didn't die in the radiation. They evolved, mutated into something even worse than before. The virus adapted, growing stronger with each passing day, faster, more relentless. At that moment, I realized the true scale of what had happened. The outbreak wasn't just a disaster, it was a cover-up. A manufactured disaster designed to hide the truth. Whatever the military had created in those labs, whatever they unleashed on the world, it wasn't meant for anyone to know. The Red Horizon Protocol wasn't just a plan for survival. It was a plan to make sure the world never found out what really happened. And so the question gnawed at me, did the military really execute Red Horizon? Did they wipe out entire cities to prevent the truth from coming to light? Or was this just a prelude to something worse? Whatever the case, I knew one thing for certain. There was no going back now. The past was buried, but the consequences of Red Horizon were just beginning to unfold. As I stared at the static-filled radio, I couldn't help but feel a gnawing fear. The military had been hiding something, and whatever it was, it had the potential to destroy what was left of humanity. By the time I uncovered the full scope of the Red Horizon Protocol, I had already learned enough to know that the infection was far from a simple viral outbreak. It wasn't just a threat to the human race. It was evolving, changing faster than anyone could have anticipated. What had started as a biological weapon, engineered with precision, had transformed into something far more dangerous. It was mutating in ways that defied all expectations, and humanity was no longer just fighting a virus. We were fighting an intelligent, evolving adversary that had already begun to outsmart us. The first signs of this mutation began appearing shortly after the initial outbreak. Survivors in various cities began reporting strange behaviors among the infected. They weren't just mindlessly wandering the streets anymore. The undead were becoming more coordinated, more calculated in their movements. They hunted in packs, using tactics that were disturbingly reminiscent of human strategy. These new hunters, as the survivors began calling them, weren't content with just attacking. They stalked their prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. They learned, adapted, and evolved far beyond anything the virus was originally intended to do. One of the first reports I came across came from a survivor in Chicago. The man had been holed up in a building for weeks, fighting off the typical waves of infected. But he quickly realized something was different about the most recent group he encountered. They weren't like the others. These creatures moved with precision, faster, more agile. They didn't just shuffle aimlessly like the previous waves. They advanced with purpose, flanking the man's position and cutting off his escape routes. The survivor recounted how, at first, he thought they were just another group of infected. But when they got closer, he saw it. Their eyes were different. They weren't the dull, glazed-over eyes of the typical undead. These eyes were sharp, focused, almost predatory. They were watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. And then, just like that, they attacked. But it wasn't just the physical violence that shook him. It was the fact that these creatures seemed to understand him. They knew how to hunt. The survivor's story was just the beginning. As the days passed, I heard more accounts from other survivors across the country, each one telling a similar tale. The infected had changed. They were faster, smarter, and more relentless than ever before. It wasn't just their physical prowess that had evolved. They were beginning to exhibit behaviors that suggested a terrifying form of intelligence. One particularly haunting account came from a survivor in the Midwest. This man had been part of a small group trying to hold out in an abandoned farmhouse. At first, they were able to keep the infected at bay using basic barricades and traps. But then something happened. The infected stopped attacking in random waves. Instead, they began working together, coordinating their movements. They were no longer mindless, hungry creatures. They had a sense of purpose, an almost human quality in the way they moved. The survivors in the farmhouse realized the full extent of the danger when one of the infected, what they described as a leader, separated from the pack and began to climb up on the roof. From there, it began barking commands to the others below, directing them to the weak points of the building. The leader wasn't just a mindless killer. It was organizing the attack. The infected were adapting, evolving into something that no one had ever anticipated. I couldn't ignore the implications of this. These were no longer just mindless zombies. They were becoming something else, something worse. The virus, the mutation, had given birth to a new kind of enemy. The hunters were just the first wave, a terrifying glimpse into what humanity was now up against. As if this wasn't enough, reports started to surface of a new, even more horrific breed of infected. Survivors from isolated communities began encountering the wardens, a group of infected that seemed to exhibit an even higher level of intelligence. These wardens didn't just lead other infected, they controlled them. They knew where to strike, when to strike, and how to adapt to counter every human defense. What was even more terrifying was that the wardens didn't seem to be attacking randomly. They were after something. They were methodical, as though they had a purpose beyond just killing. The stories I was hearing were becoming increasingly difficult to process. One survivor from a small town out west sent in a transmission that still haunts me to this day. She described an encounter with a warden who, after slaughtering the rest of her group, stood over her, watching her with what could only be described as intelligence in its gaze. It wasn't just hunting her, it was toying with her. It understood fear. It understood the psychological toll of what it was doing. The warden's behavior was unlike anything I had ever heard of. It wasn't just a killing machine, it was learning. It was adapting to human behavior, adjusting its tactics based on what it had learned. This wasn't just an evolution of the virus, it was the virus becoming something sentient. It was as if the infection itself had gained the ability to plan, to think, to manipulate. The more I learned, the more I realized that this was no longer just a fight for survival. This was a war against an intelligent, rapidly evolving force that humanity had no way of containing. We were outmatched, outgunned, and running out of time. The virus had crossed a line. It had become something far worse than a biological weapon. It had become a force of nature, a living, thinking entity that was determined to wipe us out. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding what had happened, why the virus was mutating in ways no one could explain, and how we could possibly stop it. The hunters, the wardens, whatever they were the next phase of the infection, and if we didn't find a way to stop them, humanity might not survive to see another day. The question was no longer if we could survive, it was how much longer we could hold on before the world was entirely consumed. I had never been a man of faith, but as the days dragged on in this nightmare, I found myself clinging to anything that might offer hope, no matter how fragile. It was strange. When the world first fell apart, it felt like I was running from something. Now it felt like I was running toward it, toward answers, toward whatever truth could still be salvaged from the ruins of humanity. And I knew one thing with certainty. The final transmission I intercepted had the potential to change everything. It started, as many transmissions did, with a weak signal, crackling and distorted, barely reaching my radio. I wasn't sure what I was hearing at first. Just another plea for help, another desperate voice begging for food, shelter, or a sign that someone, anyone, was still out there. But as the voice began to clear through the static, something in the way it spoke caught my attention. This wasn't just another survivor. This was someone with a purpose. "I know you're out there," the voice said, steady but strained, as though the speaker had been through more than most of us could ever imagine. "I don't have much time, but I'm reaching out to you. If you're listening, then you need to hear this. I've found it. The cure. It's here. It's real. It's there. My heart skipped a beat. A cure for the infection that had turned the world into a wasteland. It seemed impossible. I had heard rumors before, whispers of a group of doctors, of scientists working in secret to find a cure. But I never thought I'd actually hear it, let alone hear it from someone who had the answers. Could this be real? Or was this just another trick, another delusion born of desperation? The voice continued, its tone growing more urgent. My name is Dr. Lillian Harper. I worked on the project from the beginning. I was there when it all started. I know what we created, and I know how to stop it. The cure is here, locked away in a vault. I helped design it, but I can't get to it alone. I need your help. There was something in her voice, a desperation I couldn't ignore. This wasn't some crackpot making wild claims. This was someone who had been at the heart of the disaster. Someone who understood the virus better than anyone else. And she was offering a chance to end it all, to undo the nightmare that had consumed the world. Her message was short, but every word held weight. I could hear the fear in her voice, the knowledge that time was running out. I'm transmitting from coordinates. I don't have much longer. They've found me. If you can hear this, if you can reach me, please come. The cure is here, but you need to get to it before they destroy it. Before they destroy everything. And then, just like that, the transmission cut off. Silence. Silence. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the flickering radio, the static buzzing in my ears. My heart raced. Was this real? Had I just received the key to ending this nightmare? Or was I chasing a ghost? Just another false hope in a world filled with them. I knew the risks. I knew the chances of this being a trap were high. People had lied before, offered salvation only to lure survivors into the jaws of the infection. But something about Dr. Harper's voice felt different. It felt like she was telling the truth. I had to find her. I had to find that cure. But there were so many obstacles standing in the way. The coordinates she gave me weren't far, but they were deep in the infected zones. Places that had been overrun for weeks. I could hear the fear in her voice when she spoke about being found, and if the infected had evolved as much as I had been hearing, getting to her was going to be more dangerous than anything I had ever faced. Still, the thought of a cure, the hope of saving what was left of humanity, was too powerful to ignore. I couldn't just sit here broadcasting into the void, knowing that there was a chance, a real chance, to stop the infection. I packed what little I had left. Water, food, ammunition, and a small medical kit. The journey would be long, and I had no illusions that I would make it unscathed. But if Dr. Harper was right, if the cure was real, then this might be our last, best hope. Before I left, I replayed the transmission. I listened to Dr. Harper's words over and over, trying to piece together any hint that might help me find her. Help me understand what I was about to walk into, but there was nothing more, nothing that could have prepared me for the reality of the situation. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving me with one final question. Why had she reached out to me? Out of all the survivors in the world, why had Dr. Harper chosen to send her message to me? Was it coincidence? Or had she somehow known I would be the one to hear it? The more I thought about it, the more I realized the transmission wasn't just a cry for help. It was a plea for redemption. Dr. Harper had been part of the disaster, part of the team that had unleashed this plague upon the world. But now she was offering a way out. She was offering us all a chance to undo the horrors we had created. And she wasn't just asking for help. She was asking for forgiveness. It wasn't just a cure we were after anymore. It was the chance to save ourselves from the sins of the past. And that, more than anything else, was what made me act. I had no choice. If there was even the slightest chance that this cure existed, I had to go after it. No matter the cost. This was it, the final transmission, the end of one chapter and the beginning of the next. I was going to find Dr. Harper. I was going to find the cure. And nothing, not the infected, not the military, not the horrors of the world we now lived in, was going to stop me. I had always thought that if humanity had a chance, it would come from places like Haven, a city built to survive, surrounded by walls and armed to the teeth, its residents believing they had found sanctuary from the chaos that had swallowed the rest of the world. They were wrong. Haven fell, and with it the last shred of hope I had clung to. Haven was different from the other so-called safe zones. Unlike those we had heard about in whispers, places that promised salvation but turned out to be nothing more than traps. Haven was real. It was a fully functioning city, a self-sustaining fortress with electricity, clean water, food, and even a small militia to defend it. For weeks I had heard transmissions from the survivors inside, each more reassuring than the last. They spoke of rebuilding, of hope, of a future that might one day rise from the ashes of the old world. Haven was supposed to be our salvation. It was supposed to be the last bastion of humanity. I had heard about Haven long before it fell. A few survivors from scattered pockets of civilization had made their way there, some after surviving the infection and others after witnessing the destruction of other sanctuaries. They called Haven their home, and they had begun to form communities within its walls. There were doctors, engineers, and even educators, people who still believed in the possibility of rebuilding the world, and for a time it seemed like they might just succeed. But all of that ended when the first transmission came through. I was in my makeshift camp listening to the usual broadcasts on the old radio when the signal cracked to life, distorted by the static that always accompanied distant transmissions. At first it sounded like nothing more than a typical distress call, but then the woman's voice came through, frantic, breathless, and filled with terror. "They're inside the gates. They've breached the perimeter. We need help. Oh God, The transmission broke off, and all that was left was a garbled mess of noise, the voice of the woman overtaken by chaos. I scrambled for the dial, adjusting the frequency, trying to catch the rest of her words. It was too late. The signal had cut off completely, and all I could hear was the dull hum of static. I replayed the recording over and over, each time hearing the terror in her voice as clearly as the first. The sounds that followed her cry for help weren't just the noises of panic. They were the sounds of a place that was being torn apart from the inside. Screams, gunfire, the unmistakable growl of the infected. Haven was falling, and it was happening faster than anyone could have imagined. I didn't know what had happened. All I knew was that the very thing they had been trying to prevent breaching the walls, the last stand of humanity, was happening right then. It wasn't just the infected that were tearing through the gates. There was something else. The next transmission came a few hours later, and it was from a different voice. This one was calmer, but it held a deep, unsettling resignation. "We've lost the outer perimeter," the man said, his voice steady despite the panic that could be heard in the background. "The gates didn't fall on their own. Someone opened them. We've been betrayed. They're inside. It's over. Fall back to the fallback point. Don't wait for orders. Everyone's gone." I sat there, unable to comprehend what I had just heard. Someone had opened the gates? Had they allowed the infected to flood in? Or was there something more? As the hours passed, more transmissions came through, but each one grew more fragmented, more desperate. The people of Haven fought back, but they were fighting against something far worse than they could have ever anticipated. The infected inside the city weren't the slow, mindless creatures that had overrun the rest of the world. These were different. They were organized, controlled. There was no randomness in their attacks. They were tactical, methodical, and devastating. The survivors described strange new creatures, the wardens who led the charge. These weren't just the hunters I had heard about before. These were something entirely different. The wardens didn't just attack. They commanded. They controlled the infected like generals leading an army, directing them with military precision. They knew exactly how to breach defenses, how to overwhelm survivors, how to tear down the walls of havoc. In the last transmission from the city's defenders, a voice came through, shaking with fear. "They're not human anymore," the man said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "They've got someone leading them. Something. It's like they can think, plan. It's a force. It's not just the dead anymore. We've been betrayed. They promised us safety, but we were wrong." The transmission cut off, replaced by a horrifying silence. I don't know what happened next, but I can guess. Heaven's walls were breached, the city was overrun, and all that remained were echoes of the screams and desperation that had once filled the streets. In the weeks after the fall, there was nothing. No more broadcasts. No more voices. Heaven had become just another name on the long list of fallen sanctuaries, another place that had promised safety and failed to deliver. As the news of Haven's fall spread, the hope that had driven so many to seek refuge within its walls slowly died. People started to lose faith. If a place like Haven could fall, then what hope was left for the rest of us? Haven had been our last chance. We had placed our faith in it, believed that there might be a future for humanity, that the nightmare could end. But now, all that remained was rubble and silence. I couldn't help but wonder who had betrayed Haven, and why. The infected weren't just mindless creatures, they were evolving, changing, and now they had a leader. Someone or something that had the power to manipulate them, to guide them with a horrifying intelligence. Were the wardens the next phase of the virus? Was this the evolution of the infection itself? Heaven's fall was a turning point for all of us. It was the moment when the world realized that safety was a lie, that no one was truly safe anymore. The infected had changed, adapted, and they weren't just hunting, they were taking over, one city at a time. And as I sat in the ruins of my camp, staring at the radio, I knew that the world would never be the same. Heaven was gone, and with it the last hope of salvation. The darkness was closing in, and no matter where we ran, it would always catch up. But there was still a glimmer of something left in me, something that refused to let the darkness win. Heaven may have fallen, but the fight wasn't over. If there was a chance to survive, I had to take it. Because if Heaven could fall, then there was no place safe. But if there was a way to fight back, if there was still something worth saving, then I would find it. And that was all that mattered now. The first time I heard Elijah Carr's name, it felt like an answer to a question I never thought I'd ask. Back then, I didn't know the significance of his story. I didn't understand the weight of what he represented. But now, as the world spirals further into chaos, his name haunts me. Elijah was the first. The first to be infected. The first to carry the virus. And I feared the first to bear the full consequences of what humanity had unleashed. I remember the first broadcast about him. A military transmission intercepted by a survivor who had stumbled across a forgotten facility buried deep in the heart of the outbreak. The message was nothing more than a brief report, but it was enough to ignite a fire that would burn through the rest of my search for answers. Elijah Carr, Subject 0. The first confirmed case of infection. A man who had been exposed to the virus but somehow remained alive. Not fully turned, not fully human. Something in between. At the time, I thought it was just another medical anomaly, another failed experiment. The virus had been spread in so many ways, in so many directions, that it was impossible to keep track of every incident. But the more I learned, the more I realized Elijah was different. Elijah was no accident. His case wasn't like the others. He had been part of a top-secret military experiment, Project Genesis, a project designed to enhance human resilience, to push the limits of human survival. The government had hoped that by altering the human genome, they could create soldiers who could withstand any biological or chemical weapon. They had created the virus, but they hadn't accounted for one thing. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a living organism, one that evolved in ways no one could predict. Elijah Carr had been the first test subject. He had volunteered for the experiment, willing to risk everything for the chance to become something greater. But instead of becoming stronger, He became the first to carry the infection, the virus coursing through his veins, mutating him into something different. He wasn't fully infected, but he wasn't fully human either. He existed in a liminal space caught between life and death, a walking testament to humanity's hubris. As the days passed, I learned more about him. I heard whispers from survivors who had crossed paths with Elijah, each telling a different version of the story. Some claimed they had seen him wandering the wasteland, looking like a man who had lost all sense of himself. Others swore he had been spotted in the ruins of old cities, fighting off the infected as though he were one of them, but still holding on to a shred of humanity. Then came the report that shook me to my core. A transmission sent from a survivor in a small town in the Midwest. This was no ordinary transmission. The survivor's voice trembled as he spoke, and I could hear the disbelief in his words. "I saw him," the man said. "I swear to God it was him. Elijah Carr. He's still out there, still alive. He was walking through the ruins. He was stumbling like he was fighting the infection inside of him, but he was still him. His eyes, they weren't the eyes of a monster. They were human. There's something left in him. I don't know what it is, but it's there. It's still him." The broadcast cut out before the man could explain further, and I was left sitting in stunned silence. Elijah Carr, still alive, still fighting, still holding on to whatever humanity he had left. It didn't make sense. How could he still be out there, walking among the ruins, when so many others had already been consumed by the virus? And if he was still alive, then what did that mean for the future? Could Elijah hold the key to ending the infection? Was he somehow the answer? The more I thought about it, the more I knew I had to find him. If there was any chance that Elijah could still be the man he once was, then he was the key to everything. But finding him in this world of destruction, where everything was scattered and broken, would not be easy. The infected were everywhere, and they had changed, adapted in ways no one had anticipated. I set out immediately, determined to track down the one man who might hold the answers. My journey took me through desolate landscapes, past abandoned towns, and into the heart of the infection zones. But no matter where I searched, I couldn't find him. The trail was cold, and just when I thought I was getting closer, the transmission stopped. I couldn't hear anything more about Elijah. It was like he had vanished from the world entirely. Days turned into weeks, and my hope began to fade. But then, something changed. I intercepted another transmission, but this one wasn't from a survivor. It was from the military. It wasn't the usual static-filled reports or tactical chatter. This message was different. It came through with a clarity I hadn't heard in a long time, and when the voice came over the radio, I knew it wasn't a regular soldier. "This is General Thomas Hargrove. If you're hearing this, then you're one of the last survivors. We've been tracking a target for weeks. Subject 0, Elijah Carr. He's alive and he's in the infected zone deeper than we've ever gone before. We're sending a team in to capture him. You don't need to know the details, but I'm warning you now, stay away from him. Elijah Carr is no longer just a man. He's something else. The infection has taken over. It's only a matter of time before he turns completely. And when he does, he'll be the key to spreading the virus even further. Do not engage. Do not attempt to find him." The message was chilling, but it made sense. Elijah was no longer just a man, he was a weapon, and the military knew it. They had been watching him, studying him, and now they were determined to capture or kill him before he could spread the infection further. But I couldn't turn back. I had already come too far. Elijah Carr was out there, and I had to find him. The truth about what had happened to him, the truth about what he had become, could change everything. If he was still alive, if there was even a chance that the man who once carried the virus could somehow be the key to stopping it, then I had to find him, no matter the cost. I knew the risks. I knew the dangers. But what if Elijah wasn't the monster they claimed he had become? What if he was still Elijah, the man who had been part of the experiment, the one who carried the burden of humanity's greatest mistake on his shoulders? The journey ahead of me would be treacherous, The military was hunting Elijah. The infected were evolving. But I had made a decision. I had to find him. I had to see for myself if there was any hope left. The world had given up on Elijah, but I hadn't. And maybe, just maybe, he was the last chance we had to survive. The coordinates Dr. Lillian Harper had given me were burned into my mind. I had no choice but to follow them. If the transmission she sent was true, if the cure really was hidden away in the Horizon Lab, then this might be humanity's last chance to reverse the plague that had consumed the world. The stakes were higher than I could comprehend. The journey would be dangerous, but I knew I couldn't hesitate. The infection wasn't waiting for anyone to act. It was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined, and every day we waited meant more lives lost. The Horizon Lab wasn't just a facility, it was the heart of everything. The virus, the mutations, the experiments, it all began there. I had heard whispers about it in transmissions over the years, but I never imagined I would be the one looking for it. The lab was buried deep in the Midwest, far from the major infected zones, but still within reach of the disease's ever-expanding reach. Dr. Harper's message had been clear. The cure is there, but I can't get to it alone. If you can hear this, come to me. As I set out toward the Horizon Lab, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was chasing a ghost. Was the cure real, or was this another cruel trick? I had heard too many promises of salvation, safe zones, hidden sanctuaries, even rumors of groups working on a cure. They were all lies, traps designed to lure in survivors only to turn them into fodder for the infected. The last time I had put my trust in someone's promise, I had lost everything. But Dr. Harper's voice, the urgency in her words, it felt different. It felt real, and that's why I had to take the risk. The road to the lab was treacherous, winding through desolate towns and empty highways. The infected had overrun most of the population, and the survivors I encountered were few and far between. Those who had made it this far were hardened, suspicious, and unwilling to trust anyone, even other survivors. I didn't blame them. We had all been through too much to simply let someone in. But I was desperate. I couldn't afford to waste time. Every moment I spent out here was one step closer to failure. When I finally reached the outskirts of what Dr. Harper had called the Horizon Lab Zone, the landscape felt different. The air was thick with the scent of decay. But there was something else. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The infected had already been here. Their presence was undeniable. But what struck me the most was the eerie silence. There were no distant shuffles, no groans or snarls of the undead. It was as if the virus had taken over the place and the infected had learned to wait. They weren't mindlessly roaming anymore. They were adapting and they were watching. I pressed on, moving cautiously, making my way toward the heart of the facility. Dr. Harper's message had mentioned a vault where the cure was kept, locked away to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. But even with that knowledge, I couldn't help but wonder what I would find when I got there. What had happened at the Horizon Lab? If the cure existed, why hadn't it been used already? And what had Dr. Harper meant by "they found me"? As I navigated the labyrinthine paths that led to the lab, I came across old security checkpoints, faded signs warning of biohazard zones and unauthorized access. It became clear to me that this place had once been a highly secure, high-stakes operation. The lab was likely a black site, hidden away from the prying eyes of the public. What had been created here wasn't meant for the world to know. I could only imagine the level of secrecy surrounding this place, the lengths they had gone to in order to keep it hidden. The closer I got to the main facility, the more the air seemed to thrum with an unsettling energy. The doors to the Horizon Lab were locked, but the security system had long since been bypassed, either by the initial evacuation or by the infected themselves. I found a way inside through a maintenance door at the back of the building. The interior was dark, the fluorescent lights flickering sporadically as though the place hadn't been properly maintained for years. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the halls as I made my way deeper into the lab. The place felt abandoned, too abandoned, abandoned, too abandoned, abandoned. Eventually, I reached the section of the facility where the vault was supposed to be located. I could see the heavy, reinforced door standing in front of me. I knew this was it, the place where the cure was stored. The only thing that stood between humanity and the end of the world. I approached cautiously, my hand shaking slightly as I reached for the keypad to unlock the door. But just as I was about to enter the code, I heard it. A soft thud, then another, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I knew that sound. It was the sound of someone or something coming toward me. The infected, or worse, someone who had already been here hunting the last remnants of hope. I didn't have time to think. I entered the code and the door slid open with a low mechanical hum. Inside, I found what I had been searching for, the vault containing the cure. It was cold, clinical, and seemingly untouched, but I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The cure was real. It existed. But as I stepped forward to secure it, the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. I turned, prepared to fight or flee, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw. In the doorway, standing in the shadows, was a figure tall, thin, with hollow eyes. Dr. Lillian Harper. She was real. She was here. But the look on her face was not the one I had expected. She was no longer the confident scientist I had heard on the transmission. She was broken. Something had happened in this lab. Something far worse than I could have imagined. And Dr. Harper wasn't just the keeper of the cure, she was a part of something far more dangerous. The moment I stepped into the room, she raised a hand to stop me. "No," she whispered. "You don't understand. This cure, it's not what you think." And in that instant, I knew that the fight for survival had just become far more complicated than I ever could have anticipated. Everything had led to this moment. The cure was real, but the truth I was about to face was darker than anything I had ever imagined. I had come all this way, braving the infected zone, surviving the endless horror of the world outside, only to find that the answers I sought were wrapped in deception, fear, and a terrifying reality that threatened to shatter everything. Dr. Lillian Harper stood before me, her face drawn and pale, her eyes hollow with the burden of knowledge and guilt. The vault door had closed behind me with a soft hiss, sealing us in, and yet the feeling of entrapment was the least of my concern. In that moment, standing there in the shadow of the cure that could end the nightmare, I understood that I was no longer simply fighting for survival. I was fighting for truth, and maybe, just maybe, for redemption. "You don't understand," she repeated, her voice cracking with the weight of her words. "The cure isn't a cure, not the way you think." I felt my pulse quicken. My mind raced with the implications of her statement. The cure, the hope of humanity, wasn't what it seemed. It was the one thing that had kept me going for all this time, the one thing I believed could end the horror. But now, in this sterile, cold room with the dim, flickering lights casting shadows across the walls, it felt like I had walked into a trap I never saw coming. "What do you mean?" I demanded, stepping closer, my hand instinctively reaching for the vial that sat in the vault. One small vial that could hold the key to saving humanity. My fingers hovered over it, but I didn't take it just yet. I needed answers. Dr. Harper closed her eyes for a moment, as though gathering her thoughts before revealing the final damning truth. "The virus," she began, "wasn't an accident. The virus itself wasn't designed to be a weapon of mass destruction. It was meant to be a tool, a way to control and reshape humanity, to make us more resilient, to enhance us. But somewhere along the way it evolved. We didn't predict that the virus would adapt so quickly that it would take over." She paused, her breath shaky, as though speaking the words aloud was more difficult than she had anticipated. The weight of it all was clear in her eyes. She knew that the very thing they had created to save humanity had become its greatest threat. The virus started mutating in ways we couldn't control. It wasn't just making people sick. It was changing them, evolving them. That's why Elijah Carr was the first subject. It wasn't just about infection. He was a test subject for something far more sinister, the perfect weapon. I froze, the full scope of the situation crashing down on me. Elijah Carr, Subject Zero, hadn't been a victim of the virus. He had been part of an experiment, a twisted attempt to manipulate human biology, to create something that could withstand any adversary. But in doing so, they had created a monster, and the world was paying for it now. I took a step back, the weight of her words sinking in. But the cure? The vial. My voice was hoarse, the hope I'd carried for so long now threatening to crumble before me. Dr. Harper's face contorted in anguish. The vial isn't a cure, Joe. It's a stabilizer. A way to halt the virus's progression, not reverse it. The virus has already infected too many. It's too far gone. If you take that vial, you won't be curing anyone. You'll be creating a new breed of mutated human. The infection won't kill them, but it will turn them into something else entirely. Something worse. I stumbled backward, the world around me spinning. I had been so sure, so desperate to believe that this was the answer, that the cure would end the plague. But now it was clear the virus had already rewritten the rules. There was no going back. The beast had evolved beyond anything we could control. So what now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. You're telling me the virus is unstoppable? She nodded grimly. There's no reversing it, no magic cure. What's in that vial will only give humanity a brief respite. It'll allow us to survive a little longer. But that's all. Eventually the virus will adapt again. And then what? I looked at the vial, my mind torn between the hope it promised and the horrific reality it represented. I had come so far, risked so much for this moment. And now, standing at the precipice of what could be the end of it all, I felt like I was losing everything all over again. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the halls of the facility. I snapped to attention, instinctively reaching for my weapon. The infected. They had found their way inside. And they weren't alone. No, Dr. Harper breathed. They're here. The lab's emergency lights flickered on, bathing the room in an eerie red glow. I could hear the growls, the sounds of the infected, but something else was there too. Something that didn't belong. The wardens. The creatures that had been mutating in the shadows, adapting to our every move. The sound of their heavy footsteps grew louder, followed by the scrape of metal on concrete. They were here. I grabbed the vial, my hand trembling, but this time it wasn't out of hope. It was out of necessity. We couldn't stay here, not with the infected closing in and the wardens hunting us. We had no time to make the right decision, no time to find the answers. We had to leave or we'd be dead. The last hope for humanity would die in the vault with us. Dr. Harper, we don't have time for this, I said, my voice hardening with the weight of urgency. We need to get out now. She didn't hesitate. She nodded grimly, her face pale but determined. Follow me, she said, and we made our way through the back corridors, trying to avoid the creatures hunting us. The lab was vast, filled with sterile white rooms and dark corners that seemed to swallow the light. We moved quickly, making our way toward the exit. But as we rounded a corner, we came face to face with what we had been trying to avoid. A warden. It stood there towering and unnervingly still, its eyes locked onto ours. It wasn't just a creature, it was the embodiment of the virus's evolution. It had intelligence. It could think. And it was hunting us. Go, I shouted to Dr. Harper, pushing her forward. But the warden lunged at me before I could react, its claws slashing through the air. The infection had turned it into a monster, but the humanity still lingered somewhere within. Its eyes were human. The world around me became a blur of pain, chaos, and survival instincts. This was it. This was the final stand. We weren't fighting for hope anymore. We were fighting for the chance to survive long enough to make a difference. And in that moment I realized something. The virus might have taken everything else from us, But it hadn't taken our will to survive. It hadn't taken our humanity. We could still fight. And as long as there was breath in my body, I would keep fighting. The chaos of the past few days blurred in my mind like the flickering lights of the Horizon Lab, casting shadows over every decision I had made. I had come so close to the truth. The cure, the hope, the salvation. Yet the more I uncovered, the more I realized that the answers I sought weren't as simple as I had imagined. The world was fractured, irreparable in so many ways. And as the infection spread, it felt as though humanity itself was unraveling with it. In the end, the last stand wasn't about finding a cure. It wasn't about eradicating the infected or even understanding the true origins of the virus. It was about the choices we made when confronted with the reality that survival wasn't a guarantee. We had become something more than just survivors. We had become the last remnants of humanity, desperately clinging to whatever shred of hope we could find, even as the darkness closed in on us from all sides. I never found the answers I was hoping for. The Horizon Lab held no miracle, no final solution to the plague that had ravaged the world. What Dr. Harper had shown me, what I had learned in those final frantic moments, was that there was no going back. The virus had outgrown our understanding, evolving beyond our control. But in that realization, there was a truth that felt even more profound. Humanity was more than just a virus. It was more than just the mistakes we had made in the name of progress. As I walked away from the wreckage of the Horizon Lab, the sound of the infected fading behind me, I understood what Dr. Harper had meant when she said, "There's no reversing it." The cure wasn't about stopping the infection. It was about learning to live with the consequences of our actions. The virus had been born out of humanity's arrogance, a desire to control, to shape the world into something we thought we could perfect. And in the end, it had consumed us. Not just our bodies, but our ability to understand the line between survival and destruction. But that didn't mean it was over. There was still something to fight for, even if it wasn't a cure. We still had our will to live, our ability to adapt. And that, I realized, was the one thing the virus couldn't take from us. I found myself back in the remnants of the world I had once known. The desolate landscapes that had become home to those of us left behind. The streets were empty, the buildings ruined, but there were signs of life, of people fighting, of communities rebuilding in small pockets of resistance. There was still humanity here, still something worth saving, even if it was just a flicker in the darkness. As I walked through the shattered remnants of a world that had been lost, I couldn't help but think of those I had left behind. Of the survivors I had met along the way, some who had given up, others who still held on to hope, even if it was fading. And of Elijah Carr, the man who had been the first, the test subject, the one who carried the infection within him, but also the one who carried the memory of what we had done. I never did find Elijah again, but I had a feeling that he was still out there somewhere, walking through the ruins of a world we had failed to save. Maybe he was still fighting. Maybe he had already become something else. But in a way it didn't matter because we were all part of this now, part of the world we had created. And no matter how much we wanted to deny it, we were all carrying the infection in some way. The world had changed. It wasn't the same place it had been before the outbreak. The walls of society had crumbled, and the boundaries between the living and the infected had blurred. But what remained, what had always remained, was our ability to fight back, to hold on to the pieces of what we had lost, to rebuild, to learn from the past and make something better from the ashes. I still don't know if there's a way to truly end this nightmare or if we're destined to live in its shadow forever. But as I walked through the wreckage, I knew one thing for certain: we weren't done yet. We still had something worth fighting for. The infected may have changed and the world may have fallen to ruin, but humanity, our humanity, still had a chance. We still had the ability to choose, to survive, to rebuild, and that in the end was the most important thing we could hold on to. I couldn't say whether the cure would ever come, or if anyone would be able to stop the infection once and for all. The virus had evolved beyond our understanding, beyond our control, but we hadn't. We were still here, still alive, still human. And in that, there was hope. Hope wasn't about finding a cure, about erasing the past, or undoing the mistakes we'd made. Hope was about fighting through the darkness, about choosing to live and rebuild, no matter how many times we fell. So I'll keep going, because in the end, it's the only thing left to do. Stay alive, keep fighting, keep moving forward, and maybe, just maybe, the world will begin